This is Queen Elizabeth, speaking to you from the 16th century. Nothing displeases me more than history myths. And you know what I do when I get displeased? Get an axe and chop off some heads? No! I summon Professor Buzzkill, who explains everything. And I'm totally stoked that he's here again. Join me in listening to a new episode.
Yes, that's right. It's Professor Buzzkill here with you. And you know, something else is nearly here, and that's Mother's Day. The holiday has a fascinating history of its own, but the ways people have thought about the origins and the history of Mother's Day provides us a great opportunity, here at the Buzzkill Institute anyway, to talk about the complications of, frankly, history and memory. But it also provides us the chance to show how the history of Mother's Day is closely tied up with such important 19th and 20th century historical issues such as the American Civil War, international campaigns for disarmament, and peace movements from the late 1860s to the 1920s. And I hope you'll hear about some important people from the 19th and 20th centuries who you may not have known, but who deserve a great deal more attention. And as always, our archivists and historians have done yeoman work in providing us with excellent research to present to you. For instance, we've been using Lee Eric Schmidt's book, Consumer Rights, The Buying and Selling of American Holidays, which we recommend highly. But the most important scholar of the history of Mother's Day is Professor Catherine Lane Antolini, and we've put her book, Memorializing Motherhood, on the Buzzkill bookshelf this week. Check it out. Celebrations of motherhood and of mothers have a long history in almost all cultures. But the movement to establish a specific date on the calendar for Mother's Day every year started in the United States in the mid-19th century. There were a lot of them. And there were a number of these calls for the creation of a Mother's Day, official Mother's Day. Most of them didn't succeed or get government official sanction. Although we should remember that government official sanction wasn't practiced really in the 19th century, or certainly far less common in the 19th century than it eventually became. The Mother's Day that's celebrated in the United States was made an official national holiday only in 1914. Mothering Sunday had been a religious holiday in Christian churches for centuries, but it referred to, or at least originated with, the Mother Church, and that was until the mid-20th century, when popular Mother's Day observances, which are familiar to us now, sort of merged with those religious observances, and Mothering Sunday has come to be more or less Mother's Day in many countries. But strong ideas for a Mother's Day and calls for a national observance of Mother's Day really started in earnest in the decades after the American Civil War. The most famous of these, and the one you'll often hear referred to as the original Mother's Day, was proposed by Julia Ward Howe in 1870. Howe was one of the most prominent American poets and writers of the second half of the 19th century, and she's best known as the author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which she wrote in 1861. In addition to writing literary essays and novels, Howe became increasingly committed during the 1850s to the abolition of slavery. In November 1861, Howe and her husband traveled from their home in Boston to Washington, D.C. The Civil War had already started, and D.C. was surrounded by a protective ring of troops. Passing through these lines in the evening, Howe saw watchfires and ranks of cannon, and those images made a strong impression on her. She related this imagery to a family friend, and he suggested that she write a poem that could be set to the melody of the popular song John Brown's Body. And so the Battle Hymn of the Republic was born on November 19, 1861. The righteousness of the Union cause was a major reason why Howe wrote the Battle Hymn so strongly and filled it with so many biblical allusions to freeing slaves. And the melody was so well known and the words to Howe's Battle Hymn were so stirring that her hymn quickly became the unofficial anthem of the Union Army. Now, the Battle Hymn of the Republic made Howe fairly well known in literary circles during the war, and she published widely and about lots of different social issues. The horrors of war played on her mind, however, and Howe became increasingly pacifist after the war ended in 1865. The Industrial Revolution had helped increase the severity of the war and resulted in much higher casualties than previous wars. As many of you know, the Civil War, and in particular battles like Antietam and Gettysburg, produced shockingly high numbers of dead and wounded. And, far too often, the wounded were maimed in horrific ways. So like many other reformers and writers, Julia Ward Howe started to agitate for international peace and disarmament. Her other major cause was women's suffrage and the right to vote. And it's not just a coincidence that Julia Ward Howe brought women's rights and pacifism together after the Civil War. The horrors of war were made evident by the growing military cemeteries and the many survivors who were permanently disabled. Howe and a number of leaders in the women's rights movements argued forcefully as mothers and sisters and aunts and grandmothers of those war dead that women must unite and force male political leaders to disarm their military forces as the first step towards ending war as a means of settling political disputes. And pretty quickly thereafter, in 1870, in the shadow of the Franco-Prussian War, another industrialized conflict with horrific numbers of dead, Howe wrote An Appeal to Womanhood Throughout the World. It's one of the strongest and most moving pacifist appeals written in modern times. We've put the full text in the blog post for the episode on this on our website, and there are lots of excellent dramatic readings, especially by women, prominent women, available on YouTube, but I'd like to read a couple of important extracts to you. An Appeal to Womanhood Throughout the World. Again, in the sight of the Christian world, have the skill and power of two great nations exhausted themselves in mutual murder. Again, have the sacred questions of international justice been committed to the fatal mediation of military weapons. But women need no longer be made party to proceedings which fill the globe with grief and horror. Arise then, Christian women of this day. Say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us, reeking with carnage, for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence vindicate possession. As men have often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of council. Very moving and powerful. And again, I encourage you to go to our blog post to see the full text, and as I said before, go listen to dramatic readings on YouTube. Just search for Appeal to Womanhood Throughout the World. It became eventually more commonly known as the Mother's Day Proclamation, or the Mother's Day Proclamation for Peace, although there were very few references to mothers and motherhood in it. It was a more broad appeal to all women to campaign for peace. Among other things, Howe's call to action was for women to leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of council. In other words, a call for a major convention of women to discuss how to bring about disarmament and international peace. That meeting never took place, but 2 years later, in 1872, Howe called for the creation of a Mother's Day of Peace to be observed on the 2nd of June every year. That idea, unfortunately, didn't take hold either. Julia Ward Howe's Appeal to Womanhood, or Mother's Day Proclamation for Peace, is often seen as the start of Mother's Day observances, or characterized as the first Mother's Day. For example, two prominent peace and disarmament organizations, the Brave New Foundation and the Plowshares Fund, produced videos in 2007 and 2009 that credited Howe with founding Mother's Day. And we put links to the YouTube versions of these videos in our blog post. They're all very good, but I particularly like the Plowshares Fund video because disarmament is that organization's goal, and Julia Ward Howe argued that disarmament was the means by which the carnage of industrialized warfare could be stopped. But her plea did not result in the establishment of Mother's Day. For much of the rest of the 19th century, many important reformers and social activists made similar suggestions for a Mother's Day to stress peace and disarmament. But none of these ever gained enough support to become established or gained government approval or popular observance, either in North America or in Europe. Public reception of the idea for a Mother's Day improved somewhat in the early years of the 20th century. Ironically, in the years leading up to World War I, which, as you probably know, outstripped the Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War in terms of brutality and death. Mother's Day, as it's celebrated and observed in the United States, started in 1908 and was observed by all states by 1911 and was made a national holiday in 1914. One of the reasons that Julia Ward Howe's appeal to womanhood of 1870 and her 1872 call for a Mother's Day of Peace are often seen as the start of Mother's Day is what we refer to as a post hoc ergo propter hoc misunderstanding. It's the fallacy that if event A was followed by event B, then event A must have caused event B. It seems as if Julia Ward Howe was the founder of Mother's Day because she called for such a Mother's Day in the early 1870s, and she was famous, and now we have a Mother's Day. So that must have been the start, but it wasn't. My buzzkilling this misconception of the development of the Mother's Day holiday undoubtedly seems like unnecessary chronological nitpicking. But like so many other things, when we start to dig into the history of Mother's Day, we found it was much more complex and much more interesting than we first thought. Mother's Day was started in 1908, as I mentioned earlier. That year, Anna Jarvis of Grafton, West Virginia, held a special church service dedicated to the memory of her mother, who had died in 1905, 3 years earlier. Anna Jarvis got her inspiration for Mother's Day from the work of her own mother, Anne Jarvis. Now, stick with me here, buzzkillers. It's easy to confuse the two because of the similarity of their names. Anna Marie Jarvis lived from 1832 to 1905. In 1864, she had a daughter who she named Anna Marie Jarvis, the one who in 1908 started the movement to create Mother's Day. When she was a young mother in 1858, Anne Jarvis formed Mother's Day work clubs in Western Virginia to help provide better health and maternity care for pregnant women and young mothers. These clubs ran health education programs, they helped families where mothers had debilitating illnesses, they inspected milk and other foods for purity, pushed for rural sanitation, and fought infant mortality. When the Civil War broke out, and the northwestern counties of Virginia broke away to form West Virginia, Anne Jarvis and her Mother's Day work clubs took care of the wounded and the sick and the hungry soldiers from both sides who happened to be in that region. After the war, the Mother's Day work clubs held a Mother's Friendship Day for Union and Confederate veterans in the area, and they stressed community reconciliation and the burying of wartime enmities. These examples of community care practiced by Anne Jarvis, from the direct care of young mothers to the more emotional attempts to repair post-war rancor, were exactly what her own daughter, Anna Marie, was thinking of when she eulogized her mother in 1908. Anna Marie then went on to campaign for the establishment of a national Mother's Day holiday. It led to a Mother's Day proposal in Congress in 1908, which failed to pass. But all states gradually adopted it by 1911, and eventually, in 1914, President Wilson established the second Sunday in May to be the annual observance of Mother's Day in the United States. It's surprising how quickly Mother's Day became commercialized, though. Mother's Day cards, special Mother's Day chocolate boxes, as well as Mother's Day bouquets of flowers, packaged and sold by companies such as Hall Brothers, which later became Hallmark, all these became increasingly popular. Anna Jarvis fought against this commercialization, though, saying that it was not in the spirit of the Mother's Day she had founded. By the early 1920s, she thought it had gone so far that it ruined the holiday. In fact, she started boycotts of Mother's Day observances and protested at the commercialization of Mother's Day. You see, in reaction to these new traditions, the cards and everything, Jarvis said, "A printed card means nothing except that you are too lazy to write to the woman who has done more for you than anyone in the world. And candy? You take a box to Mother and then you eat most of it yourself. A pretty sentiment. And she kept up her opposition to the commercialization of Mother's Day well into the 1940s. But none of her efforts to bring Mother's Day back to her original conception of a day that truly reflected on the meaning of motherhood worked. Anna Jarvis died in 1948, never having married or become a mother herself. And her original ideas and hopes for Mother's Day could not overcome the forces of commercialism. Commemoration of the type of day-to-day hard work that her own mother and lots of mothers did for poor families in West Virginia during those late 19th century health reform movements in rural America seemed to have been forgotten. What's worse, and maybe more despairing, is that Julia Ward Howe's appeal to womanhood throughout the world never reached its goal either. After all, the most deadly conflicts in world history happened after Julia Ward Howe's death in 1910. I'm talking, of course, of World War I and World War II. The combined death toll of those two wars was over 78 million people. 18 million in World War I and 60 million in World War II. These include both the deaths of combatants and civilians, and of course many mothers among those civilians. And each of those war deaths, and the effect that those deaths would have on mothers waiting at home, was exactly what Ann Jarvis, Julia Ward Howe, and Anna Jarvis fought to prevent. Despite all the peace and disarmament movements led by women and mothers since Julia Ward Howe's appeal to womanhood throughout the world in 1870, the tendency of humans to go to war with each other seems to be tragically unremitting. Maybe on this Mother's Day we can cling to the hope that someday this will change. I suppose that as long as there are mothers, there will always be hope. Talk to you next week.